Welcome back to another Explainer. Today, we're taking a really deep dive into the fascinating psychology of workplace motivation. Specifically, we're going to unpack a groundbreaking systematic review on something called public service motivation and how that internal drive interacts with the messy, complicated environments we work in every single day. Okay, let's dive into this. Does wanting to do good actually make you better at your job? Now, for a long time, the assumption in management circles was a resounding yes. I mean, it seems like simple math, right? You hire people with a strong desire to serve society, and naturally you're going to get higher performance, better behavior, and lower turnover. But as this comprehensive review of over 2 decades of research reveals, human complexity kind of throws a huge wrench into that simple equation. The science says having good motives doesn't automatically guarantee great outcomes. It actually depends heavily on context. Let's zoom in a second and define what we're actually talking about here, public service motivation, or PSM for short. Back in 1990, theorists defined this pretty narrowly. They saw it as a drive tied specifically to working inside government institutions. But as the research evolved, scholars realized, well, this motivation isn't just confined to a government desk. Today, we understand it as a much broader, general, altruistic drive to serve the community or humankind. And this means you can find highly motivated public servants literally everywhere, in nonprofits, out in the private sector, and even just in everyday citizen roles. And that brings us to a massive paradigm shift in how we understand performance. The old view basically assumed that good motives alone drive key outcomes, like PSM just operates in a vacuum. But researchers realized that completely oversimplifies human behavior. The new view, what they call the interactionist perspective, shows us that an employee's internal drive heavily interacts with their specific everyday environment. Things like a leader's own motivation, the overall climate of the office, or on the flip side, red tape, extreme work pressure, austerity measures like pay cuts. All of these external factors interact with an employee's baseline desire to do good. To really grasp this, I want you to think of public service motivation as a lens, literally like a pair of glasses that changes how you see the world. PSM functions as a relatively stable individual characteristic, almost like a personality trait. It fundamentally shapes how employees perceive and react to what's happening around them at work. Because, public service often involves tricky trade-offs. Think efficiency versus equity, or strict rule adherence versus human compassion. Well, individuals with high PSM look through their unique lens and evaluate those situations very differently than someone with low PSM, and it depends entirely on which public values they prioritize. So, the crucial point here is what researchers call value congruence. If an employee's internal drive to do good matches the organization's actions, like if their workplace is actively signaling that public value actually matters, that employee is going to thrive. They'll respond incredibly positively. But if there's value incongruence, say you have an incredibly altruistic employee trapped in a deeply cynical or maybe highly politicized environment, their motivation doesn't just stall, it can absolutely crash, or even reverse its usual positive effects. Let's move on and see how this builds when researchers measure these interactions in the real world. They basically find 4 distinct mathematical patterns. An environment can amplify a reaction synergistically, or high motivation might buffer a negative reaction. Sometimes it's antagonistic, where low motivation leads to poor behavior regardless of the situation, or the effects completely cross over and flip directions entirely. Now, I want to focus on the first 2 because they perfectly illustrate the really complex reality of managing highly motivated people. Here is an incredibly striking example of that synergistic effect. You might think highly altruistic employees are somehow immune to burnout, right? Well, the data shows the exact opposite. When citizens are uncivil or rude, emotional exhaustion is actually amplified among those with high public service motivation. Why? Because of that lens we talked about. These individuals care deeply, and they have really high expectations that they'll be treated fairly in return for their service. So when the public is rude to them, the sting of that incivility hurts them significantly more than an employee who's, just there to collect a paycheck. But here is where it gets truly incredible. Contrast that with the buffering effect. While their exhaustion is amplified, we simultaneously see a powerful buffering effect in their outward behavior. Even though that highly motivated worker is way more emotionally exhausted by rude citizens, their high PSM actually weakens the urge to retaliate against them. Their deep-seated empathy for the citizens' needs acts as a shield or a buffer. So internally, they are hurting way more, but externally, their motivation stops them from acting out in a counterproductive way. That is just a profound insight into the heavy burden carried by dedicated public servants. Now, what's really interesting about this slide is the sheer scale of the science backing this all up. We aren't just philosophizing here.
The researchers used the PRISMA methodology, which is basically the gold standard for systematic reviews, to distill over 1,000 global records all the way down to 153 core, high-quality empirical studies. So the psychological insights we're discussing today, they are validated by a massive, heavily vetted body of global data.
And if you track this research over time, you see an absolute explosion of insight right after 2008. So what triggered it? It was the publication of a landmark book by Perry and Hondegam that basically forced the academic world to realize, hey, we absolutely must study how internal drives interact with external realities. Coupled with a rise in global research on person-environment FET, it became abundantly clear that to understand public servants, you have to look at their daily workplace context.
And this brilliantly illustrates that this awakening isn't just some localized Western phenomenon. It's a booming movement worldwide, led by researchers in places like China, the USA, and South Korea. Because that drive to serve society, and honestly, the struggle to maintain that drive in imperfect work environments, is a universally human experience. It completely crosses borders and cultures. Which brings us to our final and maybe most important takeaway. If you manage a team or work in HR, you really need to ask yourself, what happens when your daily environment conflicts with your employees' motives? We've learned today that good motives plus a bad environment usually equals burnout, exhaustion, and a massive loss of public value. You can hire the most passionate, driven, altruistic people in the entire world, but if your daily workplace culture, your rules, or your leadership conflict with their core drive to do good, you might be actively destroying their motivation. So it's really time to evaluate your own organization's value congruence. Thanks so much for joining me on this explainer. Keep learning, and I'll see you all next time.